Hookworms for Autoimmune Disease by me. Okay, let's get this started. There we go. Treating autoimmune disease with hookworms. That's what we're going to talk about. You can find out more about me, obviously, on the interwebs, but I have 21 years of practice, mostly with autoimmune disease and thousands of patients, and my own family, because all of us 5 siblings have autoimmune disease. So this has been the interest for my career, which is 21 years of practice, but in my entire life since I had autoimmune disease. All right, let's get it rolling. None of this is my original research, and most of it's based on these Australian geniuses listed here that like to experiment on themselves, which I greatly admire. So this is more for doctors, but you see here it just talks about to get treated within what is absolutely known. It puts the practitioner in a very safe place. If someone has a headache and they take aspirin, no one's ever going to point fingers about that. But also no one's ever going to get truly cured of an autoimmune disease with the current approaches that are out there, which are basically management approaches. And so toward the edges, there's more responsibility, but a greater chance of cure. So what I have found is that when you're trying to treat an autoimmune condition and you're not getting anywhere or getting stable. I mean, obviously, in thousands of patients that I've worked with, many cases of autoimmune disease have been treated by homeopathy or herbs or some kind of diet elimination. But about 10% haven't. And those particularly stubborn cases seem to have a very strong family autoimmune propensity like my own do. So that's the slide set is really for them. What do you do when everything else doesn't work? So sometimes when I'm speaking about this, I say, forget about humans. Let's talk about squirrels for a second. And I want to talk to you about 2 groups of squirrels. One we keep in cages, captured squirrels, and one live in the wild. In the caged squirrels, they have no worms. We've gotten rid of all their intestinal worms. And in the wild squirrels, they have their worms. Well, all the caged squirrels are sick, at least the 10% I'm talking about of uncurable autoimmune disease. And a lot of them have cancer in addition. And they've had their worms eliminated. Now, we didn't capture sick squirrels. The ones that we originally had were healthy and did not have this autoimmune epidemic. But when we got rid of the worms, these squirrels started getting sick. And then we have our wild squirrels, which have never had an autoimmune disease epidemic. So what that would say to me, if I was taking care of squirrels, would be to give the caged squirrels some worms and see if you can get their inflammation down. And that's exactly what happens. Now, if it works for squirrels, why wouldn't it work for humans? Just we tend to, when it comes to humans and worms, we tend to get a little weirded out, and I understand that. So all primates can share the same hookworms, even though, if you believe in the evolutionary explanation, we parted ways 17 million years ago. So these hookworm things have been around for a long time, over 100 million years. And every primate in the wild has a worm population in its intestine. And we don't, for the last couple of generations since we killed them off. We eradicated them, probably we started by eradicating them environmentally. Just putting on shoes and filtering water gets rid of the chance of carrying this certain worm population. And then, of course, in the early 1900s, there were active chemical worm eradication programs. And since doing that, we've seen nothing but what can be described as an autoimmune epidemic in addition to a cancer epidemic. Is this the entire reason? I don't know. but I believe it's one of the reasons. So when do we think about hookworms in patients, or allowing them to find their own hookworms and helping them out with some advice if they would like us to? Patients whose symptoms improve but never really get well, or patients that don't get better with all the naturopathic tricks up our sleeve, the homeopathy herbs, supplements, or they get better with diet, or they don't get better with diet, but they can never get off their limited diet. So if you take them off gluten, eggs, or dairy, or nightshades, or something else, if they ever go back on, they immediately get their symptoms back. And then after the elimination, they can become allergic to other things. So basically their immune system is this tank driving around looking for a new enemy. And, there's a house, bottom right of the slide just says House of Cards. The patient that you kind of set everything up properly for, the right diet, the right supplements, but the simplest stressor or irritant or dietary indiscretion, and they're, completely reactive again. If it's arthritis, joint pain, or colitis, loose or bloody stools, or Crohn's, intestinal cramping and pain, all the variety of autoimmune disease, scleroderma, fibromyalgia, etc. So also, the bottom in the blue, when the treatment becomes a disease, when the patient has to do so much to manage their health that they can't do it anymore, and they ask you about hookworms. So the way they're thinking about hookworms now is hookworms as the conductor. Hookworms are as intelligent to bacteria as we are to hookworms. So they're orders of magnitude more intelligent than the bacterial drones. So when the hookworm gets inside the intestine, it only lives in one small section of the small intestine. It starts setting up the bacteria in a way that makes the environment nice for the worm, which also makes it nice for you. So they're the conductor. And here's a little official discussion of the conductor-like effect of Necator americanus, the hookworm. Interestingly, I find when you have hookworms and another worm, the anti-inflammatory effect is 10 times greater than just with hookworms alone, which is interesting. We'll get to that in the last section. Oh yes, this is section 1. Criteria. What do we look for in a worm if we're going to have to regulate the inflammatory system and get the bacteria reestablished in a proper way? We look for something that doesn't create disease, right? You don't want it living somewhere else in your eyeballs or anything. Doesn't multiply in the body, so if you get 10 hookworms, you only have 10. Lives in one location, in other words, can't live outside where you expect it to be. Can't be transmitted to others, and that works well. And when you run it through that filter, one of the worms that comes out, in fact, the best worm, in my opinion, is hookworms. So we have two kind of people here. We have people like you, probably, and me, and my family, the Empire State Buildings, where when things get out of balance, it's extreme. One of my sections will talk about the Viking heritage of a lot of these patients that I've observed. And then you have the normal immune system, the pancake, which doesn't seem to react to anything. The patient can go on antibiotics and be fine, and the Empire State Building takes one round of antibiotics and they have colitis for 4 years. So the same effect that prednisone gives us, the anti-inflammatory effect that works so well, unfortunately, conventionally as a drug, it's got a lot of side effects, but the same effect that the worms give us. They're kind of what I call a biocompatible prednisone. In fact, I think the reason we respond to the chemical called prednisone is that it does stimulate the same mechanisms in the cell, interleukin 10, that the worms would be doing if we had them. We're just reproducing nature here. Okay, so Worms are smart. Humans are smarter, obviously. Bacteria is kind of dumb. But you can't let that dumb bacteria run amok in your intestine, and that's what happens to people that are highly autoimmune and do not have hookworms. The bacteria runs amok. And without the managers, you've got these bacteria building you an ecosystem that is unstable. And then on the right, when you get the right worm population, they can organize that bacteria for you. So our old view of bacteria was we had kind of bacterial places in our body that had bacteria, like the skin and the guts. But other places were sterile and didn't have bacteria, like the urinary tract and the nervous system and the brain. Well, they find out that's a complete myth, obviously, because bacteria is always going to find an ecosystem. It's been around for 500 million years. It'll find a place to live. They just haven't been able to find it in us. But we do have bacteria in our urinary tract that's normal. We have bacteria in our brain that's normal. And the problem is, if you don't have this regulator, those of us that are autoimmune see that bacteria and fight it. And the word for fighting it is inflammation. So we create chronic inflammatory disease either in our colon, or if we have interstitial cystitis in our urinary tract, or if you have dementia in your brain. Lungs is asthma, sinusitis, and it can really obviously affect a lot of things. Worms are giant. Some of them can reach 10 stories in height. Obviously not, and they're not as big as a car. If you imagine the very tip of a pencil is about half an inch. That's how long hookworms get, and they're the width of a couple of human hairs. So tiny little things. If people take 10, the hookworms feed on blood, but all 10 take like 3 drops of blood a day, which is nothing, as you'll know. So we have kind of a pre-worm syndrome where the mucus in the intestine is very thin, and different things like viruses, Epstein-Barr, eggs, gluten, dairy, bacteria, or a bunch of other allergens can get very close to the cells of the intestine and create an allergic reaction. And then we have your post-worm on the right, where they are able to be digested without creating an inflammatory response, thanks to the worms and our reaction to the worms. I put a lot of work into this side, but it doesn't make a lot of sense unless you realize I made the worms pink on this one for some reason. So if you look at the right, the mucus level is increasing. So those pink worms increase the mucus. It allows us to digest all those things that we might be reactive to, but still prevents, obviously, highly reactive substances like strep and bacteria and bad E. coli. And, it doesn't make us totally immunologically passive. It just keeps us from reacting to the normal environment. So without hookworms, look at the red. Those are the things our immune system is going to reject. Carbohydrates, gluten, FODMAPs, eggs, genetically modified, different food dyes, etc., etc. All those things you have to eliminate when you start getting sick. And then with worms, the reactive substances drop way down. You're still going to be reactive to things that are able to overcome that reaction hurdle, but you're going to be able to eat the same thing everyone else can eat, basically. Sure, we know like food dyes can be a problem, but they're not a problem for everyone. And same with gluten, eggs, and fructose, and FODMAPs, and dairy, and cheese. And, people have these things, and not all of them are sick. So we have to make you someone who's not sick, or your loved ones, or my loved ones. Okay. And of course, the most nutritious foods tend to be the most allergic because they're the most like animals. And so they're the most like bacteria. So they're going to look like something that needs to be attacked. Eggs, dairy, meats. Someone has a post-tick syndrome. Fish and fowl are going to be the most allergic foods. However, they're also the most nutritious foods, which is why people tend to get nutritional deficiencies when you have to remove these. And if that doesn't make sense, just imagine, would you rather spend a month on an island with unlimited amounts of broccoli or unlimited amounts of eggs? I think we all have an intuitive sense about that one. And this is just a way to get over the no practice. You start getting these highly autoimmune patients whose mom or dad might have autoimmune disease and a sibling or two. And you just start the no practice. No everything. You can read that. Gluten, sugar, eggs, nightshades, histamine, FODMAPs, salicylates. And it just becomes crazy diets. They're simply crazy. People are right. People do crazy diets. But that's because they have crazy bodies. So their bodies match the diets. Autoimmune diet, autoimmune paleo, and a bunch of impractical, illogical, and other irrational diets that aren't stupid. The people are doing it for a reason because they do react to these things. But you can't just keep removing things you react to. You have to make the organism stronger. And people are always beating up gluten. But I've seen in practice a gluten deficiency syndrome. There's a reason we talk about eating together as breaking bread and not breaking broccoli. There's a certain biochemistry that I believe that gluten, wheat, gives us that is very calming to the nervous system. And the people that are gluten-free that I experience tend to be a little crazy. Now, I've got to keep in mind, I was gluten, egg, and dairy-free myself for 8 years. So I'm certainly not judging anyone on their diet. But I also, at some point, realized I wasn't getting enough nutrition to be healthy, and I wasn't getting enough connection over food, right? There's a reason that people eat the same meals together or don't eat the same foods as another group. Food is a very good way of including ourselves in life or isolating ourselves. And unfortunately, those with very allergic syndromes tend to isolate themselves around meals, which is one of the most important ways that humans come together. Okay. Anti-parasitic herbs, right? So people that think, oh, but what about worms? Don't we always try and kill worms? Aren't we killing worms? Isn't killing worms the cure for all cancers, or so on and so forth? My own personal research in this matter is that anti-parasitic herbs don't really exist. I don't know, maybe there's some parasites that I don't have that are killed by worms, but I've tried to experiment killing my own worms with a bunch of herbs just for experimental purposes. It's what we do. And they don't die that easily. All ancient poo samples have worms. Kings, queens, pharaohs, etc. People with whom you'd think would have very good herbalists, including, Chinese mummies they find from Chinese tombs of the, different Ming dynasty, etc., etc. And so I have to assume that they all had herbal medicine, and that if herbs killed worms, at least these people wouldn't have worms, but they all do. So the squirrels of humanity all have worms. And plus, gorillas eat a lot of herbs, and they all have worms. So we have to wonder if herbs are that good at killing worms. Ancient medicines, I know we do a lot of these things as naturopathic doctors, and they worked great in ancient people. And I think a modern approach has to be to kind of consider, was it the medicine that was working great or the patient that was much more curable because they had a certain worm population? Okay, a couple more slides. We'll be done with section 1. Sorry for dragging this out for you. So these are my Australian researchers, and they did studies on themselves. Oh, I can use my little pointer here. Maybe it'll record. Anyway, they introduced worms. They each had some worms. Let's say they had 10. They introduced 50. They found this is the part of the small intestine. Okay. So they found the worms took, and then were gradually moved out of the body till they had their starting number again, which is very interesting. It seems like the human body has a set point for worms the same as it has for maybe Lactobacillus acidophilus or something. When you take acidophilus, it doesn't grow out of control in your body. Well, worms seem to edit their own population also, and at least in healthy, well-fed Westerners. The colony that they gave themselves at with 50 contracted until they were back to their beginning numbers. They each had different amounts of numbers that they seemed to host. Okay, going on and on here about worms. They contracted, I told you that. So, I don't know, I'm a naturopathic doctor, again, with years of practice. But I wonder, is this really natural medicine? We give 3,000 milligrams of vitamin C, which is 45 oranges. 10,000 IU vitamin A is 200 eggs. 20,000 milligrams of vitamin D is 1,000 glasses of milk. 10,000 IU of vitamin E is 1,000 tablespoons of sunflower seeds. Then there's alternative practitioners that do a lot of intravenous supplementation, which is going directly into the blood. Then naturopathic doctors will use herbs concentrated at 10 to 1 or 100 to 1. So you'd basically have to eat the whole bush. And I just don't understand anymore what's natural about this type of medicine. Is this more natural, or is restoring the natural worm population a more natural approach? And, there's some big vitamin C proponents, but both Linus Pauling's wife, the vitamin C guru, and his partner died of cancer in spite of massive vitamin C consumption. So I think there's more to the story there. 2 more slides and then I'll end this section, if I can figure out how to turn my recording off. Hormonal regulation by hookworms is a very interesting thing that I'm seeing with people that come in having given themselves hookworms. Several of them report long-standing hormonal problems got corrected. Better sleep, like really chronic sleep problems, bad anxiety, went to much better moods, much calmer, and a lot of people report increased energy. So kind of the opposite of what you might think. And obviously not all worms are good. I'll talk about that in my worm science section. But not all bacteria is good or bad either, right? We wouldn't give streptococcus as a bacterial supplement. We'd give lactobacillus. Well, obviously not all worms are more beneficial than detrimental, but it seems like the parabiotic called hookworms are one of those worms that is very, very beneficial.